Not a problem. All right, I got the recording in progress button there. So I was just saying thank you and to set us up so nicely for the session that we're back for today. And one more time, I'll just start by introducing myself and Tala again, just to remind you all, and then we'll get into both continuing our discussion on what reflective practice is, as well as hopefully having some opportunities to reflect together, as well as on one of the presentations that's going to be offered later today. So my name is Monica Mathur-Kaluri, and I'm with West Ed. Just to remind you all, I'm an occupational therapist by profession. It's been a long time since I've been on the floor with children and families, though. And I'm also come as the mother of 2 BIPOC children. So I'm happy to be here with you today. Tala?
Thank you, Monica. Nice to see everyone here again. I'm Tala. I have been working and partnering with Monterey First Five for, almost 8 years to support their early childhood workforce. And I have been offering training and supervision and consultation to many of the providers in Monterey. I'm also the mom of 2 kids, one of them being a toddler. So this idea of reflection is very relevant to me when thinking about toddler behaviors. So just a reminder here that Monica and I have been invited to offer a reflective approach that could be useful to the council in thinking about how your systems are working together on behalf of children and their families. And so today I would like to just offer a little more history around where does this idea of reflection comes from and the importance of it for providers and in particular for better outcomes from young children and families. A reflective practice is really rooted in attachment theory and this idea that our earliest relationships set us up for better outcomes. When John Bowlby and Alan Struve, psychoanalysts who have done a lot of work on early relationships, and they have had a very direct influence on reflective supervision. And this notion of being reflective on young children can really support their development. So we think of the ability for caregivers to reflect on their children's emotional experience links them to more positive interactions. When caregivers are able to see that their children are separate of them, that they have an inner life and an inner world that influences their own development, children tend to do better. And they tend to have more positive and better and stronger relationships to their caregivers. What reflection also does is it helps caregivers really think and consider where they may get stuck or where may they be having challenges or what comes up for them as they are parenting their children. And I think anyone here, including me, who has parented a 2 or 3-year-old can really understand where thinking about their experience can really help when they're having big feelings about many things.
And so you might wonder, it's important to have reflective practice for caregivers when they're interacting with their children. And what does that have to do with our group here? And that takes us to a really important key concept in reflective practice, that child is supported by their caregiver. And how they support their child is influenced by how a provider might be supporting them. And that further may be influenced by how a staff person from an agency might be supporting the provider, which further may go to how leadership might be supporting the staff or managers in between, how many ever layers there are between that child and the way agencies are run. And it really, you can see this image of the dominoes where one affects the other, affects the other, affects the other. The other image I like to use is the idea of nested dolls, those nested Russian dolls, where a child is held by a parent, who is held by a provider, who's held by staff, who's held by leadership. And that's why we're here today, in this idea where if leadership supports staff in this kind of more collaborative thinking, then staff is more likely to engage a caregiver provider in that same process of being reflective and collaborative instead of telling them what to do, which is exactly what we're hoping down the line. Next slide, please. And I pulled this definition that I really like about reflective practice. It can be an individual or group opportunity for guided support to enhance reflective practice. So the ability to explore the thoughts, feelings, ideas, beliefs, motivations, and intentions behind the work as early childhood providers and leaders. So I know there's a lot of words just there, but I'll take us to the idea of exploring thoughts, feelings, ideas, but no, stay on that slide, please. Can you go back? Thank you. The idea of exploring thoughts, feelings, ideas, beliefs, motivations, and intentions. So how often when we're making a decision as an early childhood leader, are we thinking about what was my motivation for prioritizing the list the way I did? What was my intention of, oh, I think this group really needs extra support or has been not taken care of as well as other groups? Or what was in my mind that I'm not even thinking of at the front of my mind when I'm making decisions as a leader? And then further, in these safe and brave spaces, participants deepen understanding of themselves and explore the impact of systemic inequities, implicit biases, privilege, social justice, and generational trauma on families and on themselves. So in community with colleagues, so in a group like this, participants can find support and share connection, gather wisdom, share experiences, and nurture their well-being. And as Marnie said to begin with, this is really a lot to do with your own well-being too. I think reflective practice helps us to make meaning, make sense of all of the work that you all do as leaders in connection with children and families, in connection with your own histories as your own families and everything else. Next slide, please. Actually, before we go to the next slide, were there any thoughts? I know there's a lot in this one definition. Was there anything that anybody had come up for you as you heard about, oh, that's what reflective practice is? You don't have to, just wanted to pause and give space in case anything would come up.
So glad we paused to just take in all these words, Monica. Thank you for that. I want to come back to some of the misconceptions that people may share or that you may hear about a reflective approach. And Marnie mentioned some of those, and even Monica did too. And as someone that has really supported many multidisciplinary programs in integrating a reflective approach, some folks may say, oh, reflection is really just listening, that it's not really an active approach of kind of thinking with someone or noticing what comes up for them, or noticing about the other's experience. Some folks may say this feels like therapy, and I don't want to do therapy at my work. Another misconception is that folks that have been in the field for a very long time, or licensed clinician, or someone that has a lot of experience may not benefit from a reflective approach. And like Marnie mentioned, that this really is for mental health folks, even though history is in the mental health field, it's really, really easily adapted across disciplines. We like to think of some of the core principles as starting always with self-awareness. And this idea of metacognition kind of go hand in hand. Critical awareness around my thinking and around my learning and how I understand things and what comes up for me when I hear information, when I listen to a story, when I see something, what might be part of my own earlier experiences, what biases might I be holding. We always want to consider the other's perspective and invite them to think together. So this idea of collaboration is really critical to a reflective approach. It's always equity-centered. We want to think about race, diversity, inclusion. What's important to the families and the children that we want to support? How can systems really always consider equity in the services they provide? This notion of a parallel process and how important it is.
A lot of your self-awareness pieces. what comes up for you when you hear this information? What are you thinking? How does it make you feel? Or what biases might you be holding? And this is a very little clip, so you may not cover all of these questions, but just to give it a practice shot, and then we can all talk about what your feelings were and what all of those questions, your responses to those questions. And then after we do this, we'll practice again, but on the next presentation, we'll practice what comes up for you during the presentation that will be held today. So Tala, if you can share the video clip.
Let me just say a little bit about the clip. This is a 1-minute clip about a parent and their toddler. And you're going to kind of see them interacting in a way. And then we will invite you to share with the group kind of this idea of reflective action. What comes up as you watch the video?
Thank you, Tala. All right. Myra, could you make me co-host? I can't chat with everyone, but maybe Tala, if you could just bring up the questions instead. I can't seem to put them in the chat box right now. So just asking, as you saw that video, what came up for you? What were you thinking? How did it make you feel? Anyone want to go first?
Well, I'll go just to say that, first of all, I love this video. I've seen it before, and I always have the same emotional reaction to it. But what was striking for me was Dad getting on the level with his daughter and kind of being in the place of support and guidance. You know, there was a moment in the video where she kind of was a little unstable.
Yeah.
So he was supporting, but he was also letting her lead in the same way. I mean, this was a really great example about how he let her lead, but he was also facilitating her expressing herself in a way that she could be her most authentic self. And he was leaning in to that. And I always enjoyed this video. So I just want to tell you, for me, it was a great demonstration of leadership in a way that you are not in charge of what happens, but that you help facilitate it to make it happen.
Yeah, what a beautiful comparison. Yeah, thank you for that.
I'll just comment, Laura Neal, to Lori's point. He showed how present he was in the moment, right? He didn't, have a distraction. He didn't have his phone. He stayed very present for his child, which is so important in supervision as well.
Just as a father, I put myself in his shoes for a minute thinking, man, if you fall in that mud, your mom's gonna kill me. So, but I really appreciate his patience and letting her think outside the box, right? All of our norms and structures and everything we think of rules and all of that. And he was just like, let me just go with it. And so that was very genuine and authentic.
Thank you for that reflection. Yes.
So as an African-American dad, he was also worried about her hair. right? So that's a pain to have to try and wash and deal with. So, he's like, to a point, have fun to a point. I don't want to have to do your hair. And that was just lovely to see.
Yeah, I think all of the comments that folks are sharing are very much resonating with my observation and experience as well. And I think the one additional thing that's coming up for me is that through all of those things, what ultimately happened was a connection and a shared experience of joy. And that's just beautiful. So we can have that happen even in any relationship where we take that moment to be attuned. And have that shared experience. Yeah, very lovely.
It really was a shared experience. She invited and he took the invitation and went in and said, okay, let's do this. And you could just see the joy on her face that he came in too, right? I invited me as a little kid. I had the power to bring in my dad into this messy place. And he said, yes, right? Any other last thoughts?
Yeah, just reflecting on my own internal process. Not
Yeah.
only were they sharing the joy, but they invited me internally to share that joy as well. So I certainly felt it myself.
Those of you who had cameras on, I could see the change in, listening to us talk, and then you see that, and you see the joy coming to your faces, right? Were there anything that you saw that you didn't expect to see, or anything that was, oh, this is different? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the other thing I will just interject is that the joy, and I also saw the trepidation at first from Dad, who's like, I don't know if I want to step into this, muddy pool. She's having the time of her life, but I really don't want to do this. But he did it anyway. He leaned in to really share that experience with her and also help her get to the best expressiveness she could get to. So I really thought that was courageous on his part.
Definitely.
Because the work we do is messy.
It is. It's a very direct correlation. I love, Lori, the lines you're drawing here are very similar. I didn't think about that. The messy, our work is just as messy in a very different way.
I will add that I think he leaned in quicker than I thought he was going to lean in. Like when he got in that water, I was like, no.
Yeah. Right.
I'd like to just add one other thought is that we don't often see images of like dads and kids playing in this way, and in particular men of color and African-American dads with their children leaning in, playing, being playful. And I think that's also kind of the power of watching them just enjoy being together so much.
Thank you all for engaging with us in this around this little clip. And so the same way that you so beautifully, you all leaned in and thought about this clip, we'd love you to lean into this next presentation as you're going to be hearing from Mike Fine. And with some of the same pieces, and I can send them to you, Myra, we'll get them in the chat, but these same questions of, as you're hearing the presentation, what comes up for you as you're hearing it? What are you thinking? What are you holding? How does it make you feel? Are there any biases that you may have as you're thinking about this information that's presented? So with that, I will turn it over and we will come back, and then we will have a chance to both reflect a little bit in small groups to be able to talk through what you were thinking of and what you were feeling, and then to be able to talk through the reflection in as well as reflection on and reflection for, the three different spots I had mentioned. So I'll turn it actually over to Lori, who will introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you you brought joy immediately into our meeting. So thank you, because I think it really did help set a tone for the next part of our conversation. So of course, as we go on this journey through reflective leadership and reflective practice, we wanted to kind of use an example about something that we've really been grappling with in terms of our role or our influence in education. And so I'm so happy that Mike Fine is here with us today and is going to do a presentation really around school enrollment. And then we're going to use this as, we wanted to get some practice about reflective leadership and how might we engage in a way around an issue. So we're going to have some practice today after Mike's presentation. So, Monica and Tala are going to help us have a conversation after Mike's presentation in the context of that reflective leadership conversation to give us some practice. So with that, Mike Fine, welcome. Thank you for being here. And Dr. Gus, thank you for facilitating that to happen. And so I'll turn it over to Mike Fine.
Great. Lori, thank you very much. Monica and Deneen, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen, and Monica, or several of you, I think, actually have the presentation, so I know they'll get that out to you. Just double checking here after 2 years of doing this. I'm never quite sure whether I've done it right yet or not. Do we have that title slide up? Okay, great. Well, good morning, or actually good afternoon at this point. I'm Mike Fine, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the state's Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team. We are a external state agency that created by the legislature 30 years ago to help school districts, at the time originally school districts, it's expanded to charter schools and community colleges and county offices of education, to help them predominantly with fiscal matters, but we get ourselves into all kinds of things where a district may be struggling that may ultimately have a long-term impact on their fiscal viability. And so we'll get into governance, we'll get into special education, we'll get into transportation, nutrition services, all kinds of things, almost anything except direct instruction itself. And we have a partner agency that focuses a lot on direct instruction strategies and how to improve those. So the context of why me and why FICMAN and why fiscal topics brings you a topic on enrollment trends is that we are losing kids in California, school-age kids. And that's not new, as you'll see from the data that I'm going to share and go through rather quickly. But again, all these slides will be in your hands to reflect on later and to use. But clearly during the pandemic, that rate of decline has accelerated dramatically, especially in certain regions of the state. And it's not only that it's accelerated, but it is, and this is probably just to get ahead to the end here in your reflective conversation, is we can't account for all the kids. We can't account for all the kids we once had. They all of a sudden overnight disappeared on us. You're going to see they're not in charter schools, they're not in private schools as we define them in California, and our limited way of collecting data on private schools. They're clearly some are in migration out of the state, but that's a difficult number to quantify for us. And so one of our concerns is, where are the kids, obviously, that we're kind of collectively tasked with their well-being. But in my world, I'm worried about this rapid decline in enrollment because school districts and charter schools, county offices, community colleges are all funded based on caseload. And caseload in this world that I live in is enrollment, and it's attendance each day in school. So attendance isn't just about the accountability issue, it's also what ultimately the state pays to a local school district, to most local school districts. In Monterey County, you have a couple community funded districts, which their property tax revenues are in excess of what the state would otherwise fund. And so that's really kind of why my involvement, Deneen and I have been collaborating and engaged together throughout this whole pandemic and supporting the superintendents in Monterey County on a variety of topics coming out of the legislature, input that needed to go to the legislature all around fiscal stability. So with that background and kind of context for you, let me talk about the big picture. The big picture is population, not just school age population, but population in California. The rate of population growth is declining. And in fact, for the first time in history, we had a decline in population, not a decline in the rate of growth, but an actual year-over-year decline in our population. The biggest single driver here are birth rates. Birth rates are down below the level of sustainability that we consider. Public Policy Institute of California uses a metric or reports on a metric in their research called total fertility rate. In 2020 was 1.52, down from 2.20 in 2007. But really important here is that 2.1 is what's considered to keep the population even, just avoid a decline. And you can see the 2020 number at 1.52 is below that. And that, along with certainly death rates during the pandemic and net migration out after years and years of having net migration in, all play a role here. But disaggregating this data starts to tell more stories, right? And adding other data to this and other of a 30,000-foot view of the state as itself, as a whole. There's good news in this data because some of the birth rate declines are the result of good work done in school districts and public health agencies and in the work you all do. And that is teen pregnancies are down. Higher college going rates, very positive number trending up. And when more folks go to college, then there are delays in starting families. At the same time, there are negative aspects here, right? And that is college debt extends the time that a young person, that it's taking a young person to kind of get on their feet. Housing costs, housing availability, and other broader economic issues all contribute to this struggle. A year ago, the average age for first marriage for a woman has surpassed 30 for the first time. So the average age being at greater than 30. And my 33-year-old daughter is one of these people, unmarried, you know, despite her mom and I desiring to have grandkids, she's just gonna stick it to us, right? And that's unfortunate. That's good news for our soon to be 29-year-old son. He's not ready to be a father, but that's all right. I'll leave that be, and we can analyze that and have a reflective conversation around my two kids at some point. Percent of women in their 20s living with parents at 46%, fairly significant number. Percent of men in their 20s living with parents at 51%. Our soon to be 29-year-old son has only been out of the house for about 2.5 years. Now, our daughter didn't come back to our house except for a few months after college graduation. She's been on her own, owns her own home, all that good stuff, right? But our son obviously stayed a little longer, as long as mom and dad were paying all the bills, you know, why not kind of thing. But part of that was he still needed to figure out what he was going to do with an undergraduate degree. And then when he made that final decision, go off and get his master's, go off and get his, in this case, his teaching credentials, a high school English teacher and a coach. And so on, that just took him a little longer, where our daughter was a little bit more focused, right? Lots of different reasons for these metrics, okay? But they're all contributing to a lower birth rate. Let me note this, while Public Policy Institute refers to total fertility rate, just think about birth rates, which are reported by the state. And let me give you some history. We're currently below 12 per thousand. At the peak growth period following World War II and into the 50s, we're at 25 per thousand births per year. Coming out of the Great Depression in the early 30s, we were at 12.6 per thousand. So we were lower than, we have a lower birth rate today than we had coming out of the Great Depression in the early 30s, okay? This is a look at the state by decade and our percentage of growth. So you can see where we're at. The blue, as opposed to the greenish color here, is the projection. And what I'm going to tell you, these are all Department of Finance projections, but the current decade of 2020, 2030 at 5.2, I believe that's high. That is yet to be influenced by the pandemic. And the pandemic's going to bring that number down. Okay, that percentage. These are percentages. Okay. Migration out. If we pick up a media report, newspaper, look at local reports or statewide reports, we see a lot of discussion about folks leaving California. The data, though, is more telling. It's not as great a migration out as I think we're led to believe, but as with any data, when you disaggregate it, it becomes far more meaningful, right? There's no question that we now have a net migration out this past decade compared to the past. 6.1 million moved out, while only 4.9 million moved in. But who moves out and who moves in are very different. Those that move here are more likely to be of working age. They're employed, they have higher ed, they're younger, they're recent college grads, and they have promises of six-figure jobs in most cases. Now, there's good news buried in that, right? If they stay here, they're likely to start a family here. And then our birth rate cycle takes from there, right? Those that left California cited jobs, housing, families, the primary reason for leaving. But I would also tell you the data points that these are generally lower income, generally households with multiple parties in them, so families that are leaving us. And that would contribute, obviously, to school age, drops in school age populations, right? So declining enrollment in TK-12, transitional kindergarten through 12th grade, is not new. You can see where we've been since 04-05. We're a decade and a half into this. We've lost almost 500,000 kids, though, in that period of time. And for a good period of that time, as you can see the data, we were relatively flat between 10-11 coming out of the last recession into approaching the year before the pandemic in 18-19. That vertical line that you see there is the pandemic. So that's March of 20. And you can see what's happened as a result since, or we believe as a result, because there's nothing else that really explains this acceleration except the pandemic. That's our variable, right? We don't understand it, I will say that, but it is the variable that we seem to want to point to at this point. It's going to get blamed for a lot of things, I think, whether it had anything to do with it or not, right? All right, so this is the data just reported as a state this past fall. And by the way, enrollment, when we talk about enrollment, it's always measured on the first Wednesday of October. It's called Census Day in California, or for those of us that have been around for decades, we used to call it Seabed's Day. And so pre-pandemic, about 60% of our school districts were experiencing declining enrollment. Today, it's much more significant. But over the last 7 years, almost 5.5% decline, but you can see the acceleration of that decline between 2019 and fall of 20, and then softened as we came into the second year of the pandemic in fall of 21. Still a decline, but the rate is somewhat diminished, okay? Kindergarten's an important grade, and right now California has a 2-year kindergarten program, transitional kindergarten, and the wisdom of my colleagues in Sacramento, we currently don't report enrollment at both years. Absolutely absurd, but we don't. We do report attendance, and I'll break that out for you in a couple minutes, but we currently don't report attendance at both years. Trying to get that changed. It's a simple, somebody just make the right decision. We don't think we need the legislature to tell us to do what makes sense, but that may be ultimately where we end up with. Kindergarten enrollment runs about 8.5% traditionally of total enrollment in a TK through 12 grade span. You can see that in 2021, though, we were at 7.7, the lowest K enrollment in a decade. And so I've given you some additional data for both falls. As a percent of enrollment, we have gone back to 8%, not 8.5, but we're growing. So this past fall, we did have a pickup in kindergarten. That's good news. Why is kindergarten so important? I think it's probably obvious to all of you, but it's usually that first point of relationship with a school district, right? Whether that's an elementary district or a unified district, it's the first point of connection. Transitional kindergarten now being that plan point, and then certainly pre-K programs that we all have knowledge about and have interest in. You can see in the fall of 2021, kindergarten percent went down almost 12%, but this year we have a little bit of uptick in it. Okay, we certainly haven't recovered, but at least we've changed the direction of the trend. Okay. The breakout between traditional kindergarten and transitional kindergarten, I can do the breakout for 2021. The estimates here are in 21, 22, and I have to do that right now based on age, because again, we don't report the students at those two grade levels. I have to look at their birth dates, and I don't have that level of data yet for fall of 21. In addition to kindergarten, here's a look at the other grade spans. And you may say, my goodness, this isn't how we report grade spans. We report them TK through 3, 4 through 6, 7 and 8, and 9 through 12. But I chose to break them out based on data trends, because I thought it was interesting to see that grades 1 through 5 are down. We've just talked about K, but grade 6 is down, is almost flat. It's not down nearly what it was in the earlier grades, in the primary grades, and so on. Grades 7 through 8 have our actual largest decrease by grade span. 9-11, not 9-12, is also down, but grade 12 is up. And so we need to study some of this a little bit. But one thing that's evident, not only from the enrollment in grade 12, but also attendance rates, is our kids that are in high school are focused on graduation. Even despite the pandemic, they are focused on the last day of their 12th year, walking across that stage and receiving a diploma, right? What our ultimate goal is in the system. Attendance reflects that as well. They are focused on staying in school, completing their A through G requirements and graduation requirements. That's really good news. That's my read of some of the data when I start to break it out by grade span and grade, and look at enrollment and attendance together. Okay. This is data, statewide data, and I pulled for you this morning. No, this was one of your interests. I didn't realize that, Monica. Thank you for sharing that earlier. I pulled this data from Monterey, and it's at the end of my presentation itself. I'm only reporting where there's a 2% decline. So the groups here, so you won't see Hispanic on this list or on the Monterey county specific list, because there is very little change in our Hispanic population. Okay, but you do see where at any of these 3 points in time, 3 years rather, there was a 2% or greater change. I chose to pull that data. So this, as you can see across the state, these are all negative numbers. When you get to the Monterey specific data, it needs some careful thought and reflection, because it's a little all over the place. And you'll see that in just a second. And so I think a deeper dive on the data I pulled this morning from Monterey County is worthy of someone's attention. This is by region of the state. I didn't include, only for space, the inland, Southern California inland, so Riverside, San Bernardino counties. They are historically the fastest growing counties in the country, and they are flat for all intents and purposes. Riverside a slight growth, San Bernardino a slight decline. Otherwise, these are counts, county counts. So there are 58 counties in the state. You can see I gave you total and I gave you non-charter. So non-charter are traditional public schools. The state uses this term non-charter. So I'm using it here to match the data in case you wanted to go disaggregate this data and look at my data source. So I'm using the same terminology. But you can see here where we're at. We actually have improvement this fall in the data as far as enrollment. Historically, we've had declining enrollment along the coast and increasing enrollment inland. That has been, while that trend is still true, it's that apple cart's been upset a tad during the pandemic. It's not a one-for-one relationship anymore like it was historically. It's a little mixed bag out there. Okay. By the way, Superior, California, for those who are not familiar with the demographic term, that is basically just below Sacramento and north, center of the state east. So it doesn't include the North Coast, but Sacramento north and basically east from there is called Superior, California. Why they got that name and the rest of us didn't, I'm not quite sure, but I'll leave that to somebody else. So here's private school data, and you'll all appreciate this. Private school data is voluntarily reported. There is no enforcement role. There's been attempts by the legislature to enforce this after some pretty horrific reports, actually a couple out of Riverside County and a couple from other places of homeschool environments that were not at all safe for kids. But what we do here, this includes what we call homeschools. And the way we differentiate that is if a private school has filed an affidavit with the state to say we exist, and they have 5 or fewer kids enrolled, we define that as a homeschool. If it's 6 or more, we define that as a traditional private school. And actually, as you look at the data, it starts to make sense. Our traditional private schools, and you have some in your county, not too many when we look at your data, but those schools operated by a Catholic diocese or a church organization or just a private foundation or other group, they experienced the same trends during the pandemic that everybody else did. For the most part, they're at capacity. They don't have ability to grow, right? They've got facility limitations than others. What did take off and grow during the pandemic were the homeschool categories. In fact, you can see 5 or less affidavits grew from 27,000 to 39 or 34,000, and then it leveled. I'm sorry, I'm reading this chart the wrong way. 22,000 grew up to almost 35,000, and then this year settled down in December at around 27,000. But you can see where enrollment went. The line above, 5 or less enrollment in 1920 was 38,000. Well, let's go back to 1819. It was 25, grew to 38, grew to 59, and then it settled back in the 47 range this year. Okay, and so that is generally that homeschool environment. Now, what we do know is we have a lot of homeschool operations out there that are not reporting. And some of that's not consistent with law, and some of it is. If that homeschool has a certificated teacher, so if my wife were operating, who's a teacher, elementary school teacher, if we were homeschooling our kids and she was the one doing it, we wouldn't be obligated to report that at all to the state because she's a credentialed teacher with a proper credential for our kids. Okay. So that's what's happened recently. Now let's look at the news going forward. You can see the blue line here is actual number of student loss over the next 10-year period from 21-22 to 30-31. And the green line is the percent. So Los Angeles County, with our largest school age population, expected to lose about 260,000 kids over the decade that we're in, almost 19%. Right next to them, Ventura County at 18%. Monterey is in here at 14% decrease, basically a 10.5 thousand student loss in this decade. The state average is a loss of 500,000 kids at 520 or 8.7%. There's actually 19 counties out of 58 that are going to have, forecasted to have higher percentage loss in enrollment than the state as a whole on average. Okay. I'm going to switch gears here from enrollment to attendance because we had attendance data from last fall up through December before we had enrollment data from the state. And so this slide kind of summarizes the data, but I want to emphasize here, you can see by the grade spans at the top chart, and over at 9-12, you can see attendance rates drop by only 3.6% compared to 7-8, 4-6, and TK through 3. Okay. So that was my comment earlier about those high school kids. And then you can see at the bottom the kinds of institutions: school districts, traditional school districts, charter schools, county offices of ed, both alternative ed and district funded ADA, and then statewide numbers. So attendance is down 8.5% statewide, but you can see that at school districts, it's down 9%, charters down 3%, county offices by half. Deneen can share some of her insight with you from her colleagues on that and so on. Okay. I'm going to shift back now to enrollment, and these last few charts are Monterey County specific, okay, as opposed to statewide. I threw these in, not sure where you're going to go with your conversation. So you can see your history and you can see what the projections are. What's interesting is 21-22, this school year, you were projected at 75,128. You actually came in at 74,700. So you actually lost more kids this fall than what the State Department of Finance's projection was as a county. Okay. I took some of the same charts as I just presented to you a minute ago, statewide, and just put Monterey data in them. So you can see what your data from a percent looks like, very similar to the state, a little less than the state in both years, fall of 20 and 21. And then kindergarten, you're doing a little better this fall than the state. Actually, for the last couple of years, you've done better than the state at kindergarten. And then private school data, including the disaggregation of 5 or less or 6 or greater. Because we're talking about kids, we don't worry about the number between 5 and 6. Kids don't come in. We don't count fingers and toes. We count the whole child. So don't worry about that distinction there. And then public school enrollment, non-charter and charter. You can actually see that from fall of 2021, your charter enrollment at 2244 dropped a little bit to 22,078 in your county. Charter schools overall mirror traditional public schools. They are also declining. I'm going to go back for a second to this attendance. Only 125 out of the almost 2,000 charters in the state grew by 30% or more. These were pre-existing, what we call non-classroom based charters, meaning they were already virtual instruction. Kids didn't have a physical place they went to school, okay? And so when the pandemic hit and parents didn't want their kids in brick and mortar settings, they moved into these handful of charter schools here. And that's why you see their growth in attendance being fairly dramatic compared to everybody else. Okay, I meant to point that out when I had that slide up. It's the only reason I left that slide in for you was to point that out, but I failed to do it. And so as I conclude here, here's your subgroup data that I added this morning. You can see some pluses and minuses here, so not consistent over the period. And you see even at the bottom, the homeless roughly declined between 1819 and 1920, about 5%. Then in 2021 grew substantially. So these are children experiencing homelessness. And then this fall, we have a decline again. And with regard to foster, substantial decline this fall. So I don't know if those are data anomalies. I just, after communicating with Monica this morning, I pulled this data real quick. I did go back and double check my own math, but I certainly didn't have time to explore some of these year-to-year changes. Some of you may know this data obviously far better and know exactly what's going on. But this gives you a sense of where you're at subgroup-wise. So any questions that I can answer about the data?
Well, first of all, Mike, I really thank you for this presentation. I know I've taken notes all through the presentation. There's so much here, which I think is going to be very rich for our remaining discussion, which, you know, we're going to be limited, but I think it's a good launching pad for us to start a conversation that can continue in our next meeting. So at this point, and I just can't thank you enough, Mike. There was so much there, so much that I had some reflections on, but I'm going to turn it back to Monica and Tala to lead us through a short conversation to help us practice some of that reflection that we've been talking about. Because this gives us a real issue to tackle and reflect on. So with that, Monica and Tala.